So today we're going to talk about intergenerational dealings and something that I think will help aid in all facets of our interactions, not only with medical students and future residents, off-service residents, but ancillary staff as well. Kind of an interesting topic, in my opinion. Although not a CME lecture, I have no conflicts of interest financially, but I will let you know that I am a Gen Xer. Our objectives here are to review the generations and describe differences, to discuss how differences may affect feedback, and strategy to give feedback to current learners. So let's talk about the players first. The greatest generation, and every generation pretty much is split into sub-generations. Greatest generation, we're going to find more or less with emeritus leaders in universities, maybe some chairs at the universities as well. But not many of the GI generation left. They were born between 1901 and 1924. They experienced World War II as an adulthood. The silent generation from 25 to 45. These experienced World War II in childhood and the civil rights movement's beginnings. But now we start moving into people that we deal with. Our baby boomers, boom generation. The first part of it is 1946 to 1964. Their notable occurrences: space exploration, first modern counterculture. And from then we go on to Generation X, split into the baby busters and the MTV generation. The busters are 75 to 80, and they experienced Vietnam and the Cold War. And with some overlap, the MTV generation is 75 to 85, the rise of mass media, the end of the Cold War. Our leaders right now tend to be some boomers and a lot of Gen X. Gen Y is also known as millennials, 78 to 90. The rise of the information age, Iraq War, rising gas and food prices. And then Generation Z is this new generation, and we're actually starting to see a couple of them start trickling in as medical students. They were born from 95 to 2007. The rise of the information age, the intermediate bubble, the digital globalization. This Generation Z is also known as Zoomers, and it's only appropriate that we're giving this lecture via an online platform when we're talking about them. So let's talk about how one family in 4 generations really kind of encapsulates everything about intergenerational relationships. Great grandpa was born in 1911. At 1919, he was 8 years old. He grew up in Sheffield, England, and was allowed to walk 6 miles during his free time to go to his favorite fishing hole. That large circle is great-great-grandpa Sheffield's domain as an 8-year-old. His son, the grandfather, Jack, was 8 when in 1950. He was able to go about a mile to walk around the woods, chase after salamanders, explore, play with his friends. And he gave birth to a son, Ed. To a daughter, Vicky, who was 8 in 1978. And she was allowed to walk to the swimming pool that was about a half-mile away. So you see, in each generation, it's getting smaller and smaller. And now this mother's son, Ed, is 8 years old, and he's allowed to walk just to the end of the street, about 300 yards or 3 football fields. What's interesting is, although mom could walk around and ride her bike, mama refuses to let Ed ride the bike anywhere outside the cul-de-sac. And in fact, they take the cars, load them up into the SUV, and they drive out into the country to go on family bike rides when the son wants to ride a bike. So in just 4 generations, we can see that one family, and this is a true story, one family really changed the amount of room that we'd let an 8-year-old explore. And when we think about it this way, it's easy to see that, with intergenerational dealings, if we look at it only from our own perspective and don't consider who we're talking to, we really can miss out on the big picture. So how many of you remember these? Back in the comic books, you get those really cool X-ray specs, and I may or may not owe Columbia House money still for the 13 records or tapes that you could send for a penny or a dollar, and get roped into their scam. But here's the key to these ads: we waited 6 to 12 weeks when we sent these away to get what we wanted sent back to us. And I would argue that probably everyone in the room, although you may not have got the cool X-ray specs, did something where you sent something away and just waited, a quarter of a year to get something back. And that was normal. But our millennials and our Generation Z are growing up with this. As we live now, Facebook, getting likes, Hulu to watch any of the old shows that they wanted, Netflix, etc. Amazon, if they really want to wait, they wait 2 days with Prime to get something delivered. But I've had stuff delivered the same day. Instagram, they get the likes. They get instant feedback right away from anything they do online. Anything that they want is readily available and can be delivered immediately. This is what people are growing. Millennials had this as they grew up. Generation Z has had this since birth. So it's that change, that waiting. Heck, we won't wait any. Our generations won't wait anymore. We're just bought into this like everybody else. When the GI generation was getting feedback and rewards, no news was good news. Satisfaction was a job well done. They got feedback on performance as they listened, and they wanted subtle private recognition on an individual level without fanfare. There's a reason they're called the silent generation. They just sat and took it. And if the GI generation is still around and trying to give feedback to the millennials, it's not going to work if they try to do it from their own frame. The boomers like praise. They also like title recognition. They want this recognition to be public. There's going to be a ceremony. We're going to get people plaques. We're going to put those plaques on the wall, and we're going to let everybody know that we were the salesman of the month, or we were the educator of the year. And those awards give appreciation for all the long work and hard work that they did. Generation X doesn't really want public recognition. Freedom's the best reward. And from personal experience, I'll tell you that's the way I feel. Give me a task and I'll get it done. When I get my task done, I want my time off, and that's the real reward. We like, as a generation, we like regular feedback on the work, but we're less dependent on being told that we're good people rather than the work's being done well. But if you give us constructive feedback, we tend to be more effective. We're a self-sufficient generation. If we have some structure, some coaching, but not micromanaged, this generation does very well. The millennials, however, like to give feedback, be given feedback often, and they will ask for it. And for any of you that have sat on the interview trail this year, I would say this is one of the most frequent questions I get, is how will I be given my feedback? They want to have meaningful work, and they want to be clear about goals and expectations. And some of the meaningful work means that they want to skip some steps. They don't need to start at the ground level always, or at least they don't think they do. And somehow you have to be reeled back in to let them know that you walk before you run. Communication needs to be done frequently. You have to provide supervision and structure. They want recognition from their heroes and their bosses. But managers who balance these frames of reference and rewarding workers create a more valuable experience for both the employee and the worker. The millennials can be great to work with as long as you work within their constructs. If you understand that they want that feedback and that's what's missing, it works very much into your favor. And then this new generation, Generation Z. As a generation, they want to increase the frequency of their feedback. Studies showed that 60% want to hear from their managers on a weekly basis and 40% want to hear on a daily basis. When you figure that their bosses can be boomers who wanted a yearly sit down and a review and a reward, this does not mesh. But the rub with this is that they want to decrease the duration of the feedback. They don't want to block an hour with their manager. They want a quick, less than 5 minute meeting on the fly to let them know what's going on. And if you really want to hit them where it counts, make that feedback high tech and high touch. And we're going to talk about that in future lectures about how we're going to incorporate feedback with the residents specifically. So how does this relate to feedback? Well, traditional methods of feedback may not work between the intergenerations, and the residents that we're going to get, like I said, are going to be millennials and Generation Z or Zoomers. So the way we did it, the way that we came up, the way that we were treated in residency, not the way that we can treat our residents. Just sitting there silent isn't going to work. There's a story about Brian, and Brian was a Gen X manager of a call center, and he had 23 employees. Those employees ranged from boomers to millennials, and Brian was happy with how everybody was working. Brian would tell people that they were doing a good job, give them a pat on the back, and move on. Brian also had all of his millennials quit on him almost en masse because there was no appreciation from Brian. And Brian was stymied by this. He said, I tell everybody that they're doing a good job. I give them a pat on the back. But nobody, the generational approach was not met. Nobody acknowledged the feedback. Brian never said, I'm going to tell you what you're doing right. He just thought by telling them they're doing a good job and letting them keep on doing what they were doing, that was appreciation enough. And Brian wound up having to get a new staff. So label the feedback. This concept of Pixar didn't happen on the internet. Same thing with feedback. When you sit down with your resident, let them know, I want to give you a little feedback on this shift. Or, hey, we've worked a couple shifts in a row. Let me give you some feedback on this run that we've had. Once you label what you're about to say as feedback, that matters tremendously. You've defined what you're doing. You're going to put everybody in the right mind. And it's very clear that feedback is about to be administered. So how do we do it? Make sure you give it in person, over the phone, or via video chat. Give it as close to the incident as possible. If something goes wrong with a case, the best thing to do is sit down and say, hey, let me give you a little bit of feedback about what happened there. This is where it went sideways. And tell them right away. Telling them at the end of the month or putting it into an evaluation that's not going to be looked at for another 2 or 3 months downstream isn't going to help anybody. Don't do it via text, instant messenger, or email. Too much can be misinterpreted from these mediums. How many times have you looked at a text and you put the voice in that text? Somebody says they're doing fine. You can say, hey, I'm fine. I'm fine. Fine. You don't know, but you're going to put the person that reads the text puts the voice in the text, not the person that wrote the text. So avoid that by not giving the written feedback without giving the in-person, over the phone, or video chat feedback. And be specific. Share what actions worked and what didn't work. Make sure that you avoid absolutes. Once you say something like you always walk into a room and never wash your hands before you talk to a patient. Once they can say, but you just watched me wash my hands, you've lost all credibility. Never is the same way. Absolutes should not be used when giving feedback. And make it a dialogue. You don't just want to go up there and hammer them with everything that went right or wrong. You want to give them an opportunity to talk back, to share in the discussion, and to figure out an action plan for where it goes on. And you want to share both good and bad. It's just as important to say, that's a great note. Hey, you're really doing a good job increasing the number of patients you're seeing. The positive stuff is just as important. But the one caveat is, the human nature throughout all generations is we glam onto more of the negative feedback than the positive. So I just gave a lecture yesterday with Grand Rounds at Broward Health, and in the next day or two, I'll be getting my feedback. I'm sure there will be some very nice positive comments, but there will be a couple negative comments on there too, and those are going to be the ones that I start with. We all do. So be cognizant of that people glam onto your words that are negative more than they do the positive. And we can talk about how to face that in future lectures, but it's very important to keep in the foremind when you're giving this feedback. So 4 strategies to help avoid giving the same feedback to everybody. Balance the positive and the negative, like we were just saying. Describe the problem specifically. I'm sure, like myself, you got a lot of needs to read more, work on differential, see more patients. Not very problem-specific feedback on the evaluations. Go a little bit deeper. Resident gets bogged down when handling a critical care case, but continues to pick up patients. Go ahead and finish the critical cases first, and then get back into picking up. That's something that a resident can work with. Involve the learner in the solution. Hey, I see that when a level 1 trauma comes in and we go in, that for the next hour or so you're kind of flustered. How do you think we can fix this? And then establish a follow-up expectation. All right, so I see that we're working together in 3 weeks. When we work then, let's see if we can improve on what we did on this shift, and see when that works, what we can do in the future for the next step. So one of the helpful things is to keep the think mnemonic in the back of your mind. Before you give the feedback, is it true? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? And is it kind? You can give negative feedback that's still kind. It's all in the words you choose to use. And likely that negative thing that you have to say is necessary. How you decide to give that information makes it inspiring or not, and that can make it helpful. And if you're doing this, I'm hoping that all the information that you're about to give feedback on is true. And you can also make it SMART, meaning specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-based. Instead of broad strokes, see more patients, be specific. When we're working in Purple Pod, we can see more patients per hour than we can see in Orange Pod. So I'd like to see you pick up a few more patients there. I'd like to measure that over the next 2 to 3 months. And I believe that it's achievable because your colleagues can do it as well. It's relevant to the resident because you're a PGY3 at the beginning of your PGY3 year, and you're looking to get a job. And they're going to expect you to see more than half a patient an hour. And as far as the time-based, in the next quarter, I expect you to go from a half a patient an hour to 1.6 patients an hour. And for those of us that will be doing the ACGME required quarterly and biannual reviews, make sure that you follow the ARCH mnemonic, allow and ask for self-assessment. And this is actually going to be part of the resident's 360 evaluations. Reinforce what's being done well, that positive reinforcement. Confirm what needs to be corrected, and help the learner with an action plan for improvement and coach as needed. So how do we truly give constructive feedback? Set this idea that feedback is a way of life here. And I've been already telling our the people that we're interviewing that that's going to be the culture here in our department. And because of that, that's the expectation from the onset of July 1st. Make sure that we explain the why when talking to the resident, why we expect what's going to be done, why this policy and procedure has to be followed, and let them learn from you. You show the resident what excellence looks like. And most important, be direct and drama-free when correcting. In JAMA 2018, there was an article talking about mentoring millennials, some of these myths, truths, and best practices. And I think this is an interesting table. We're led to believe that the millennials are an impatient generation. But millennials are accustomed to rapid information and distillation of that information. So avoid doing the same thing over and over, or the inertia, and instead allow them to be innovative with their learning and their processing. We think of them as an entitled generation, but the reason for this is that they don't view social distinctions and hierarchies as previous generations did. So as much as we can try to, and it's tough in medicine, but try to avoid the hierarchy. So in this case, a PGY1 versus a PGY3, we may have different expectations of them, but the PGY1 is not a lesser resident. They're just a more novice resident. So what we should strive to do is give autonomy to the resident as time goes on. They're not so much a lazy versus a balanced generation, but instead they're motivated by a purpose, organization, or mission. And it's amazing talking to these candidates in the interviews about how much they have given back to their communities in medical school and in prior schooling, and how they're already looking to be able to give back when they get here. So instead of giving them busy work, give them purpose. A narcissistic or empowered generation is actually one that desires early achievement based on vision and deliverables. So instead of looking at them as subordinate, give them opportunities to gain leadership. And that can be within the residency itself, and they can be leaders to themselves and to the medical students. But it can empower them and allow for a better transition. A social or collaborative view that we have of the generation is a generation's view of having a greater sense of global consciousness. So instead of trying to look at them all as the same, embrace their diversity. And the ACGME makes this a mission within within the accreditation body, and they're looking for diversity within medical education. And instead of looking at a needy versus an engaged generation, look at a generation that instead has an instant response due to social media and technology. So don't isolate them. Make sure that we give them a sense of community, and it's something that they're looking for, even as we talk during the interview trail. So in conclusion, children nowadays are tyrants. They contradict their parents, chatter before company, gobble their food, and tyrannize their children, our teachers. And we can all look and laugh and say this has probably been said by somebody about the millennials or Generation Z. But it's actually attributed to Socrates, who lived between 1470 and 399 BC. So if Socrates was having intergenerational problems back then, what chance do we have today? Thank you all for listening, and I'm open for any questions.